And breaking overnight, CNN has exclusively obtained two new videos offering a more direct angle and vantage point of the midair tragedy between the American Eagle's flight and the Black Hawk helicopter. A warning, these videos are difficult to see as we are also learning more about the 67 lives that were lost in this collision. This morning, the New York Times is reporting that the helicopter may have been flying outside of its approved flight path and higher than it should have been. We'll get much more to that. Let's get to the videos. The first video we want to show you, the bright light that you see at the top is the American Airlines jet as it approached the runway. Then you see the helicopter flying directly into the frame and directly into the plane. Both aircraft immediately then crashing down into the Potomac River. The second video, it appears to be surveillance video from the airport and showing the very same helicopter moving along the river as the plane approaches the runway at DCA, and then the collision and the explosion and into the Potomac River. Horrifying. Both now to the investigation into what led to that horrific crash. Both of the so-called black boxes have been recovered from the commercial jet, are being examined and analyzed. Those black boxes are going to be key to pinpointing what exactly happened in the moments before the deadly crash. CNN's Renee Marsh is following all of this live from Reagan National Airport. Renee, what is the latest that you're picking up?
Well, let's focus on the victims first, Kate. We can tell you that as of this morning, 14 bodies are still missing, 4 of them still pinned inside of the aircraft, and 2 of the soldiers who were inside of that Black Hawk helicopter have yet to be recovered. We know that recovery efforts will resume soon as sun comes up this morning. Now, we also are expecting the flight manifest with the names of the victims, all of them who were on board the commercial aircraft, to potentially be released today. And we also know that President Donald Trump has plans to meet with some of the victims' families. It is unclear when that meeting will happen. Now, as for the investigation, that is ramping up this morning. You mentioned the black boxes have been recovered from both aircraft, both the airplane as well as the Black Hawk helicopter. The NTSB telling us yesterday that they expect to have a preliminary report with a readout from these black boxes within the next 30 days. Investigators are also waiting for a crane to arrive on this crash site. That crane will be helpful in trying to remove much of this debris. That will be critical in this investigation, as well as the debris will hold clues for investigators. And Kate, this morning we're also learning about staffing in that air traffic control tower. We heard that air traffic control audio in which they warned the pilot of the Black Hawk helicopter about the commercial regional jet. And now CNN has learned that one air traffic controller was actually working 2 different tower positions, directing traffic for both local traffic as well as helicopter traffic. However, this source tells us that that is not out of the norm. Kate?
And Ray, there's also new reporting today about some other recent close calls at DCA. What are you picking up on that?
Right. So what we have learned is just about a day before Wednesday night's deadly incident that there was another flight approaching Reagan National Airport, and it was forced to abort its first landing after a helicopter came close to its path. So concerning information that there was another situation where a helicopter yet again coming close into its path. And I've spoken to several people within the aviation industry yesterday, and they brought up this idea that it is time to ask the question as to whether these military aircraft should be flying in the same airspace along the same path as these commercial aircraft. Of course, as the NTSB wraps up its investigation, which will be many, many months from now, they will make recommendations that will essentially change aviation safety for years to come, to essentially make sure that this sort of thing does not happen again. But certainly people paying a lot of attention as to whether these military aircraft should be flying in the same airspace as these commercial aircraft around this airport. Kate?
Renee, thank you very much. John?
And as Kate was mentioning, there is also new information this morning on the Army Black Hawk helicopter in the crash. Sources tell the New York Times it appears to have been too high and out of its approved flight path. There's some new information on the pilots of the helicopter as well. Let's get right to CNN's Natasha Bertrand at the Pentagon. Natasha, what's the latest from there this morning?
Well, John, we're still trying to sort through all of the information that we're getting about this Black Hawk, and the Department of Defense, of course, is doing the same. It's interesting that the New York Times reported that this was a helicopter that was flying at above 300 feet because the helicopters that are training as part of these missions with these Black Hawks, they're supposed to be under 200 feet. And in fact, CNN has reported that the last reading that this helicopter gave and provided to these flight radars and flight trackers was that it was at 200 feet at the time of the collision. So either that was incorrect or something else went wrong here, but that is going to be part of the investigation as well. Now, we know still that the helicopter was on what has been described to us as a pretty routine training mission. This is something that the pilots would have been experienced with because, as we reported, the pilot and the co-pilot, they've had between them about 1,500 hours of flight hours, and so they were not junior pilots. This is not something that they would have been unfamiliar with. However, Pete Hegseth, who is the Secretary of Defense, he did acknowledge yesterday that a quote mistake was made and that there may have been an elevation issue. Now, the Times is also reporting that the flight of the helicopter may actually have deviated a bit from its flight path. There are very specific predetermined flight routes that these helicopters are supposed to be taking, and it's our understanding that this helicopter did shift from what is known as flight path 1 to flight path 4, which may account for why it was making those maneuvers at that time. But still, so many questions to be left answered here, including, for example, were they wearing night vision goggles, which may have something to do with their vision being impaired, as President Trump suggested yesterday. So all of these questions have yet to be answered, and I know members of Congress have similar questions. Senator Tammy Duckworth, she also told Jake Tapper yesterday that in her briefing from the FAA, there were more questions about whether this helicopter was on the appropriate flight path. And as Renee mentioned as well, we are still waiting for these two other crew members from this helicopter to be recovered. So far, only one has been, John.
All right, Natasha Bertrand at the Pentagon, raising so many questions. Any one of these slight deviations certainly could have contributed to this disaster, but that is why an investigation is underway.
Recovery efforts are going to be intensifying in the Potomac River this morning as divers continue the search for the remaining victims of this tragic collision. The teams are facing significant challenges underwater in near zero visibility, even though the twisted fuselage rests in just a few feet of water.
The mud becomes an intense problem. The severe lack of visibility means that they are going through an aircraft in braille. And now we're going through an aircraft fuselage that is torn apart. So every foot, every 6 inches that you move, there's a potential of another snag, some potential injury for the divers.
And joining us now is retired Navy captain and Navy diver Bobby Scully. Bobby, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. I just have to say, imagining the horrific scenes that many of these divers are going to be encountering is very, very difficult to think about. And I am just struck by how much we owe our first responders because the things that they do for us in the wakes of these tragedies is just phenomenal. And I'm hoping that you can kind of take us inside and help us understand what it is like in a situation like this, especially when you are also facing incredibly adverse conditions, freezing water, that makes it even harder to do this really, really difficult job.
It is. It's a very difficult job, Casey. Thanks for having me on board. This is one of the hardest jobs that I think divers end up doing. And unfortunately, we get called upon to do this more than we like to think. It's hard, rigorous work to do. You heard in your previous piece that, it's cold, it's dark, it's a lot of hazards with the twisted metal and the aviation wire and that sort of stuff. So physically, it's a hard job. Emotionally, it's a hard job too. For a lot of divers, you're just in the mission and you try not to think about the mental aspects of the job. and you put that on hold until after the mission is done. I think a lot of us would say that, we don't think about that until much, much later, but that is something that comes into play, and leadership has to deal with that and make sure that their divers are taken care of. All their first responders obviously have to be aware of that and take care of those aspects. The weather that's coming in, of course, is going to make this job even tougher physically, and it's just something that we really need to give our first responders and our divers a lot of credit for.